Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. Today, I sit down with John, Diane, and Cody, who have been fantastic partners with the Center around the intersection of criminal justice and intellectual and developmental disabilities. Today, we talk about how intellectual and developmental disabilities are a hidden population within this intersection, why it is so important to talk about providing accommodation and not just services to this population. And most importantly, the amazing CommCard program that they're doing in Benton County, an elegant solution to support communication and accommodation for folks in educational, medical, and criminal justice settings. Welcome to our conversation. Today, we have Dr. John Gottschall, Diane Scottaline, and Cody Gottschall with us to talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities as a hidden population within the criminal justice system. Dr. John Gottschall, who likes it when I refer to him as John, so I'll refer to him as that for the rest of the podcast, is an ICO doctor and an intellectual and developmental disability advocate. Diane Scottaline is the executive director of the Benton County ARC, and Cody Gottschall is a DD self-advocate and is on the board of the ARC of Benton County. Welcome. I'm so glad you all could join us today.
Thanks so much for having us, Chris. This is great. Thanks for your interest in people living with developmental disabilities.
When we talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities, what are we talking about?
This is Diane from the ARC. Thank you again, Chris, for letting us talk with you today. We can start with a definition of developmental disabilities. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that definition is someone who has a lifelong condition that can be either physical or mental or both, that creates an impairment in certain significant domains of life, such as self-care, mobility, communication, employment, and things like that. So just by definition, that's the population that we're talking about. And those impairments range from very mild, just maybe a small speech impairment, to more profound, such as cerebral palsy or someone severely affected by autism.
I might mention that the definition of intellectual disability is defined by an IQ of less than 70 or 75, depending on who's defining the intellectual disability. And there are several problems with that definition, which are related to the IQ test. So the IQ test is somewhat arbitrary. It's not routinely obtained. In California, it's illegal to use IQ tests for people that are Black because of the discriminatory nature of the test itself. So when we talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities, we should remember that 30%, so a substantial minority, have a significant impairment in IQ of less than 75. The majority of people don't have a severe impairment of intellect, but what they do have is a different way of thinking and looking at the world. And in a world of people that use sarcasm and indirect language and a lot of body language, they have difficulty interpreting that. So there's a spectrum, and the spectrum varies from people that require help with every activity of daily living, including personal hygiene, and who are nonverbal, to people who are successful in college and have the potential to have jobs if their employer and other people that they interact with accommodates, makes some simple communication and sensory accommodations, they can be very productive members of society.
So when we think of intellectual and developmental disabilities within the larger culture, I think that it's a very narrow definition. And what I'm hearing from you all is that it's an incredibly wide definition, both in functioning, but also in what people experience. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's a very good explanation. Mhm.
Also, in the conversations that we have a lot of the time when we're talking about statute and policy, a lot of our conversations are around psychiatric diagnoses or substance use disorders. And while a lot of statute covers intellectual and developmental disabilities, the policy, the statute, and the operations, intellectual and developmental disabilities seem to be a somewhat hidden population in how we roll things out. I know that you all have been pretty big advocates around having a different kind of conversation. What are we missing when we talk about policy, statute, and operations with the hidden population with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
It's a very interesting question. We have to go back to the idea of services and institutionalization in the 60s. And so people with developmental disabilities and people with severe illnesses like schizophrenia were often institutionalized. In fact, going back 100 years, children with autism were institutionalized with a diagnosis of juvenile schizophrenia. There is no such diagnosis as juvenile schizophrenia. Today, we would call that autism. And so there's been this confusion that relates way back to when we were institutionalizing people. We don't do that as often and really rarely now, but the historical entanglement of disabilities with mental illness persists. And that's an important thing to think about for several reasons, one of which is that the response to a disability should be the provision of accommodations. The response to a mental illness should be treatment. The response to substance abuse should be sobriety and treatment. And sure, those things intersect, but we can't really treat a person with a developmental disability who also has a mental illness, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD. We can't treat them unless we first provide the accommodations. An extreme example would be if we had a person with diabetes who also had a visual impairment or was blind. I can't treat that person's diabetes until I accommodate their vision impairment. I can't give them standard written handouts to educate them about their diabetes or give them an AccuCheck device that checks their blood sugar with a printed information about their blood sugar. They need to have accommodations for their blindness before we treat their underlying condition. And the same is true for the developmental disabilities. We have to accommodate them first. But people aren't thinking about that because there's been an entanglement of the diagnosis of developmental disabilities with mental illnesses.
I think also, Chris, we can talk here about the importance of early identification. When Cody and John Gottschall first came to the ARC a couple of years ago, we were just starting to develop programs at the national level at the ARC US for advocacy within the criminal justice system. So it was something that was coming in front of us. We were thinking about it a little bit more, but Cody and John came to us with a personal experience and a burden that kind of brought us into that arena of advocacy at a really good time. So the problem often is that the data is just not there. We started having conversations with people at the commission. I'm looking at Cody's holding up his card. Yeah, I want to talk about that. Cody's holding up a card that he developed from the Brain Injury Institute, I think. And Cody, let's talk about that later because I get real excited talking about the CommCard because it's made and was developed by a self-advocate. And I think that's what my favorite thing about the CommCard is. But going back to the data, the available data, it's just not there. And when the director of the Justice Commission identified this as a blind spot, we asked him if we could quote him on that because that's exactly what it is. We're just not able yet to identify how many people we're really talking about. We're doing a better job now in the school system, so we're capturing those children when they're younger. The assessments are a little bit more thorough now. There's more programs and services available for children at a variety of levels. So a lot of the data that we now have is coming out of the pediatric studies, and so then we can extrapolate that into the adult population. But I just wanted to make a note of the importance of that early identification. And so when you have someone going from 0 to intercept 3 in the criminal justice system, there's a lot of opportunity in there for them to get lost if that disability is not identified early on. And a lot of trauma can take place between 0 and 3, before we're even talking about incarceration. So that's what awareness is all about. And that's part of what this campaign is trying to do, just raising awareness of, first, on the side of the self-advocate, for them to be able to make a decision when and how to disclose a developmental disability that they have. And then also on the side of systems and helping professionals to be perceiving rightly and to be asking the right questions and asking the questions in the right way to make sure that people are feeling like their disability will be accommodated, and certainly, and then getting those accommodations.
I can say from the center, this is one of the ways that we ended up meeting y'all, was that we realized that our language that we had on our website primarily talked about psychiatric diagnoses and substance use disorders. And even though we were doing work around intellectual and developmental disabilities and introducing that into the conversation, it couldn't be found anywhere on our website. So we worked with, as a growing edge, we worked with y'all to update our website information and start an intellectual and developmental disability toolkit so we could start introducing more the idea of this hidden population into the conversation. Yeah, the three of you have been great partners in that, I have to say. You've been really, really helpful, and I'm glad that we can continue to have this conversation.
Information is key, isn't it? It's empowering to have information. The ARC Benton is currently scheduling training sessions with law enforcement and other helping professionals around the CommCard program. So we schedule appointments, and we invite law enforcement to come and meet with a few of our community members with developmental disabilities, and the community members with DD are getting acclimated to the CommCard, which we can talk about a little bit more. And the officers have an opportunity to meet and greet those potential card holders, so they can meet them by name. So they have a chance to meet these community members that maybe they wouldn't normally see, but they don't want to just meet them in an altercation or in a negative situation. And what we're finding is that there are a few people that need a little extra encouragement just to come to a meeting because of an experience that they've had with a law enforcement officer. Just to be in the same room, even in a benign setting like a CommCard training session, it could be pretty traumatic for them just to sit there in the same room with a police officer. So we have had a couple who have kind of pushed through that anxiety and PTSD and come and had an opportunity to share their experience with the law enforcement officer, and then had the policeman talk with them about why they respond the way they do, and what they're thinking. When you turn and you run away from me, this is what I'm thinking. And then the person with the developmental disability can say, well, this is what I'm thinking when when I see a weapon, or when I hear, these other, noises, this is how I'm feeling. So those meetings have been so instrumental in raising awareness on every front, among families, among people who experience a developmental disability, among law enforcement professionals. So going back, if we can talk about the CommCard for a minute. So when we first started developing this, Cody showed me a card that he was carrying that he kind of developed with some help from some professionals and his family. But it was I think it was kind of a generic card, wasn't it, Cody? I don't know if it was fully customized for you, but it had some really important information about him and some of the consequences of his traumatic brain injury. And we got to talking about this card, and Cody really liked it and felt the facility of it could be a little bit more widespread. So we talked about the possibility of creating something that people with developmental disabilities could use as a communication tool. So just to de-stress and reduce anxiety in a difficult conversation, because for many people with developmental disabilities, normal social communication is challenging, but when you add stress to that, it becomes nearly impossible. So we started asking people, we were getting all kinds of different feedback. We started asking families what they thought about a tool that someone could carry, in this case, a card that could have important information about their diagnosis, information about what behaviors might be present associated with their developmental disability, some suggestions for communication accommodations. I could communicate best if you help me in this way. And then the names and phone numbers of two advocates that can be reached in case the conversation isn't going well, or if the person with DD felt like they needed a little bit more support. And the feedback we were getting from family members and self-advocates and helping professionals and those that we spoke to was overwhelmingly positive, because many of them had situations already where that card could have been useful. And they were saying, man, I just wish we had this tool to get that information into the right hands, because it's difficult to verbalize your needs in a really escalated situation. So if we could just have all this information condensed on a card that can be, just the reading of the card slows the situation way down. So Cody's showing his card. It has, I have autism, and in parentheses it says that he's verbal, so that'll give the information that you probably will be able to have a conversation with him. It has his advocate names and phone numbers on the front, his own address and date of birth. And then on the back, Cody, would you mind if we read yours on the back? So it says, because of my autism, I may, and I can't read all the fine print. Cody, would you mind giving some of the information that's on your card?
So it says, because of my autism, I may, and then it says, appear not to be listening, have difficulty deciphering nonverbal body language, need more time to think before responding. Then it says, I want to cooperate. To help me, please speak slowly and give simple instructions. Allow me to think before I answer a question. Do not assume that my autistic behavior is defiant. And then it includes familiar stress-reducing topics. And for me, I have Star Wars, games and movies, and recent life events.
What a powerful tool.
Chris, that whole Star Wars thing, you're such a natural, because you saw his shirt, you wanted to connect with Cody, and you guys immediately had this Star Wars connection. And Cody has done the same thing with many people. And it's just so easy to get that conversation going when it's not an adversarial conversation. One of the things that I'm thinking as I listen to this is that what we're really talking about is the classic fight or flight reaction that people have to a stimulus. A bull is charging me and I'm in a field. Do I run, or do I stand my ground and prepare to fight with the bull? Or do I just stand and hope that he stops? Well, Cody's not very good at fight or flight. That's not in his repertoire. He will tend to withdraw from a conflict. And then once you start talking to him about Star Wars, it'll draw him out. But we've had a number of cases of people with developmental disabilities that do get into that fight or flight mode. And it's worse if they've already had one bad interaction with law enforcement. Then it's even, more fight or flight. And I thought you might like to hear about our friend Eddie, if Diane wants to tell that story.
Eddie is a self-advocate, and he has spoken at a Pathways to Justice training that the ARC of the United States brought to Marion County. And he shares a story publicly. He's given us permission to share it, about an incident that he had that was based on a very simple misunderstanding, but just went south really quick. And it was just him being in public, probably spending more time in eye contact with somebody who he didn't know longer than that person was comfortable. So his intentions were misunderstood. The police were called in very quickly, and it turned into a foot chase. and, crossing a busy street and ending up in a bus terminal. And he eventually was charged with jaywalking and another like disturbing of the peace, but he was tased as he was running away. He was so fearful. He didn't know what was going on, really. He was just running from what was a very fearful situation for him. So it's those situations that we want to avoid, because once that traumatic situation is done, the trauma still remains. And Eddie's doing a great job self-advocating. He has taken that incident and he's turned it into a real passion to inform law enforcement and to help other people that may have similar experiences, or to avoid those same experiences for other people.
This all rolls into the work that we do at the center around crisis intervention team and the training that goes along with that. I know that in the Oregon region and the Pacific Northwest region, a lot of teaching time is also spent talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's a wonderful program. It's a volunteer program. And you don't always know that you're going to have a CIT trained officer responding to a scene. I love the work that you're doing in Benton County around the meet and greets. What a wonderful experience, both for education and for healing some of that for both officers and for the folks that they're working with in the community to get to know each other. So if there is a call, then I already know this person, right? I already know how to respond. I know when I worked in the prisons, that was huge. If I already knew who the person was, when I responded, I knew what kind of things to chat with that person about in order to help de-escalate the situation, and what a lovely experience that is. And also for the folks who might come in contact with law enforcement, that they know who the officer is. So it's a little less scary. But there's also times where you don't know who those officers are. You're in a different community and something happens, and the CommCards are an elegant solution to slow down the interaction and let someone know what could help and what hinders. What a wonderful solution that you guys have been working on. I've heard you talk about the CommCards before, but I haven't had a chance to see them. So thank you so much, Cody, for sharing yours.
You're welcome. One of the
What
things that I brought up during one of our recent training sessions was maybe for the individuals who have had the traumatic experiences with the officers, where the officers have all of their gear on, maybe we can start with having them practice using the card with a plainclothes officer, then with an officer who has their bulletproof jacket on without all of their equipment on, and then transition to having that officer go out of the room and then come back in with their gear on. Because in that way they get the practice with the plainclothes officer, then with the officer without their gear, and then with the officer with their gear. So it starts to make that entire trauma from their past experience become less intense.
That is such a great idea.
First of all, it's all about trust. And it's heartbreaking for me to think that there are people that may need help, whether it's somebody with a developmental disability or their family, and they're afraid to call the police because of a past experience or something they've read about. And so it's not just a card, it's a program. And the program is to develop that trust, and CommCard stands for communication and accommodations. But it's not just a card, it's a program. So as we've gotten to know people, we're now working on, well, how do we work with this sense of PTSD, this fight or flight reaction? And it's a surprising number of people. It really is. And I don't think we want to do it on our own, because we're not, I'm a doctor, and I can put a central line in or intubate, but I'm not a psychologist. So we're working with people in the mental health field. And what we'd like to do is have a network of folks that can work with people with developmental disabilities. Cody's had the benefit of a coach, a counselor who has helped him, and he doesn't have much of a fight or flight. He's working with the police. But he did that because he has some support, some behavioral health support. Behavioral health is the destination, and we want to work with professionals. The police, they're not social workers. They don't have a counseling degree, although they have to do a lot of counseling. And so we don't want to wing it. We want to figure out how to do that safely, and we're working on that.
That cues me into crisis intervention teams. We're always talking about it is not a training, it is a program, and it is about connecting with the local community and the resources. The research has found that officers who are CIT trained are much more likely to make a referral and be aware if the person that they are talking to may be experiencing symptoms and need services or accommodation. So I know that you've been in contact with your local CIT program and have been working with them. I think we also need to talk about this is really difficult for the officers who are responding as well. Officers are so thirsty for this knowledge around psychiatric concerns, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and neurocognitive conditions. There has been so much interest in crisis intervention team training and mental health first aid. I don't think we've talked about the disability resource team yet.
The disability resource team is sort of the first step in bringing the Pathways to Justice training from the ARC-US into a local chapter. So in this case, it would be at the ARC of Benton County. The Disability Resource Team is a multidisciplinary group of family members, self-advocates, professionals that identify areas that need improvement in accommodations and awareness and access within their system. And they work together to strategize some solutions. So we're educating one another, we're identifying blind spots together, and we're also strategizing on ways that we can support each other and sharing knowledge and information that could really improve outcomes and improve professional competence and professional experience. So people feel better about what they're doing when they're better at it, when they feel like they're being effective. So this is not just for people with developmental disabilities, it's for the community at large. Everybody feels a lot more competent and useful when they're doing their job well. So we've begun a disability resource team. It really started with the Corvallis Police Department. They actually approached us a couple years ago. They said, we have this crisis intervention training and it's pretty robust in Corvallis, but we're starting to recognize our need to acknowledge developmental disabilities as a unique minority. And they are the largest minority group in the country. So they were starting to understand their need and they came to us, they reached out to the ARC and said, I'm sure there's information out there, but we want to make sure we're getting the right information. Can you guide us and direct us to the right resources? So they were actually the ones that took the first step in asking for some guidance and some help. So they were a natural for us as a partner when we began to develop our disability resource team. So it does include law enforcement and includes, we had conversations with Judge Donahue, who is a drug court, circuit court justice at Benton County, and other legal professionals all around the state. Really, it's not just limited to Corvallis, but when we do bring that Pathways to Justice training, we'll bring it to Benton County sort of as a pilot. And this is to help victims advocates, legal professionals, and law enforcement to understand developmental disabilities and to accommodate them in better ways.
I had an opportunity to be a part of the Pathways to Justice training when it came to Marion County, and it was highly enlightening for me. I was able to be part of the court system piece of the training, and it was a great conversation around how to rethink policy when we're talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, because it's a different way of looking at the issue. I think again, John, about our conversation earlier around services versus accommodation, and thinking about treatment versus thinking about accommodation. That's a different mindset when we're thinking about that within the criminal justice system. It's different than what would usually happen with psychiatric diagnoses. It becomes around all the wraparound, which is incredibly important, and then it becomes about a medication. But for intellectual and developmental disabilities, it looks very different, and I don't think people are used to having that conversation about how that looks different.
I wanted to piggyback off your comment, but also Diane's. Just as we think about how we categorize things and the names that we're using, the semantics. So Going back to the term disability resource team, the ARC of the US actually calls it a disability response team. And Captain Rubin in Philomath said, don't call it response team. To us, that's lights and sirens. We want to slow it down. And so that's how we use the same acronym, DRT, but it's a disability resource team. And our job is to network and provide resources and to gather resources from people like you and other interested parties. And it's just been really inspiring to see how many people are like you and Ari Wagner who go, oh, I've seen this. And so that's a lot of fun. The other thing about that name, Disability Resource Team, is it's not the Developmental Disability Resource Team. It's the Disability Resource Team. The point being that if we can apply these principles of access, awareness, and accommodations to DD, we can generalize those to every disability. And so beyond that, we could talk about universal design. And what's wrong with giving everybody communication accommodations according to their needs? Wouldn't things work better? And so you start to think about universal design. And then in our everyday lives, you think, well, gee, haven't I benefited from curb cuts, even though I don't use a wheelchair? Of course. Pushing a shopping cart or a baby stroller. And haven't I benefited from the ramp instead of using the stairs from time to time for whatever reason? Even though I don't have a doctor's note that I have a disability, I can still benefit from these simple accommodations. They are mostly simple communication and sensory accommodations. They don't cost a lot of money. We don't have to have anyone construct, a different front door or anything like that. It's just a different way it's a more aware way of relating to our neighbors.
How many times have we all walked into a building with our hands full and used our elbow to hit the pad to open the door for us, right? Because we have too much stuff and not enough hands. That's a great way to talk about accommodation. I think a lot of people, when we're having this conversation, focus on services and they don't think about accommodation. So can we talk a little bit more about what the difference is between accommodation and services and where that gap is if we only talk about services?
It's estimated now that 1 in 6 children, this was a test or a study taken between the years of 2006 and 2008, but 1 in 6 children are experiencing a developmental disability. But I would go so far as to say not all those children are going to require services as they grow older. They may be getting the help and the support they need from their family, from their teachers in the school age years, from their natural supports and the network around them. And they may not qualify for services through their county developmental disability program. But that does not mean that they will not need accommodations. So when we're identifying or trying to find data about people with DD, we are often talking about those people who qualify for services. So those services are hours of support by a direct support professional or a personal assistant. So that's somebody who comes into your home and helps you with daily activities or activities of daily living. And that might be employment services, that might be nursing care. So there are a lot of people who do not need that depth of services. And if the IQ threshold is 70, what about those with an IQ of 74 or 78 or 82? They're still going to be struggling, and many of those people are not going to be discovered until they fail time after time after time. So what we want to do is cast a broader net to make sure we're not leaving people out simply because they don't qualify for state-funded services. It's estimated that 18% of the population experience some form of disability. So that's a far cry from the 1.5% who receive services. If we don't acknowledge that additional 16+%, we are really doing a great disservice to a large segment of the population who are not going to be noticed until they fail.
I think that's the best explanation I've ever heard of accommodation versus services, Diane. I know it's a confusing conversation for a lot of folks. So this makes me think of when we're talking about the criminal justice system and law enforcement or security or parole and probation is responding to a situation. what would they be looking for to start to clue in that accommodations are something that they should consider?
I think part of the problem is a lot of the behaviors that are displayed by people with a developmental disability resemble substance abuse or, severe mental health episodes. So sometimes the law enforcement's reaching into their tool bag and, they're making very quick decisions. And the biggest tool in their tool bag is probably response to substance abuse. That's probably something that they confront most often. So I wonder if Cody would be happy to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've at least noticed is that if you mention any information to an officer right off the bat during a confrontation, the whole confrontation is going to go much smoother for both individuals. But whereas if you don't bring up that you have a disability or a condition, then that is going to cause the officer to have to come to a conclusion on their own based on what they see. When you arrest somebody, the officer has to put their hands on you. And some people with autism, for example, have sensory issues and do not like to be touched. And so they will react very dramatically if an officer does lay their hands on that person, which is one of the reasons why the CommCard has multiple lines that say, these are what accommodations I need from you, and these are how I respond to these specific inputs.
Cody, that's such an excellent point. We talk a lot about education and what to be looking for in a situation. You're right. There's so many possibilities of what someone could be presenting with a particular behavior. And the early communication and the self-identification that there is a concern with the CommCards are such an elegant solution to help de-escalate that situation quickly with early identification. And then the person that is self-identifying, that really helps them be more in control of that situation and what's happening by self-identification and not relying on the officer to be able to identify what's going on with them, because none of us are psychic, right? When we all walk up to a situation, there's lots of possibilities of what could be happening. The CommCard solution is, I keep saying it's an elegant solution, but it really is simple and highly effective, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I think that's key to our success at the ARC Benton in all these open doors that we've had in talking with justice officials and law enforcement and other helping professionals, because we haven't just come to them with a problem. They get problems laid on them so often, and people complaining about legitimate complaints about problems. And could be a little bit of advice for those who are listening that may be wanting to bridge that gap and develop those relationships a little bit more. The reason why they've been so successful with the ARC Benton is, in one hand, we're presenting the problem and presenting the data and these anecdotes of incidents and traumatic stories. But at the other hand, we're extending this tool and this strategy, the solution. So they're receiving us with both arms, saying, okay, I will acknowledge that there's a problem, there's a blind spot, and thank you for bringing along with you this solution of a tool that we can put in our toolbox that can bridge that gap and help us provide some early identification of the disability. We're guessing, we are guessing. We're using the knowledge that we have. The CIT training they're receiving is very good training, but it's different than, or I should say it's limited in its scope to what the disability resource team can offer. So they're very grateful. And when you do that, when you come and you approach a problem with a strategy and with a solution, you're going to get a lot more invitations for conversations than if you're just laying problems on people's laps.
Absolutely. And what I love about the work that you're doing with the ARC of Benton County and the Disability Resource Team is that you're bringing all the stakeholders together, right? So it's not just a siloed conversation, because it's the other thing that happens a lot of time is that just you and I talk, but then there are so many other points in the system because it's such a complex system and everybody's left out of that conversation. And so it makes it difficult to solve a systemic issue when you're only talking to one person. And so you all brought in all the different stakeholders into the conversation to try to start to have solutions in Benton County, which makes such a huge difference. The other thing that I love about the CommCards is that it really gives self-advocates a choice on whether to give that information or not. I know that some of the other conversations that have happened have been around if there could be a flag. So when dispatch is called, that there's a flag that there is a concern, and there are concerns on both sides, and thinking it's a good idea on both sides, right? So on one hand, it lets the 911 dispatcher know that there could be a concern and that what would be helpful in that situation. And on the other hand, which is wonderful because then law enforcement and dispatch has a heads up at the beginning, just like with the work that you've been doing around, hey, we know this guy, right? Like they have for that one person out in Philomath, this is what helps and this doesn't help. But I've also heard that that also makes some folks pretty nervous to have that flag in the system. For folks that does make nervous, or for other folks that just want to have the CommCards in case they're not known in that system, what a great solution. And the use of that CommCards for other situations that aren't involving law enforcement contact. I can imagine that CommCard would be helpful for other daily interactions when it becomes difficult. Have you had experience with the CommCard being helpful in other interactions beyond law enforcement contact?
We presented the CommCard to my colleagues, the nurses that work in the intensive care unit, and they found it useful. And we've had some really great outcomes from providing accommodations instead of, restraining people. We had a patient, for example, that the CNA, who is very DD aware because she has a son with autism, instead of restraining this young woman with autism, she's walking her up and down the hall. And it was perfect. There were no disruptive behaviors because she knew how to accommodate that person. And this has become even more important now with COVID and limitations on visitors, which have unfortunately resulted in limitations on support staff and advocates. By the way, that shouldn't happen. The ADA and access to support staff and advocates is important whether there's a pandemic or not. And so that's the ICU nurses. That one of the IV therapists said, we would love to have that. And can you imagine, you're an IV therapist, you walk into a room and somebody doesn't like to be touched and you're supposed to put a catheter in their vein and put a tourniquet on their arm, or even just vital signs. We all know it's a little uncomfortable to have your blood pressure checked. So just being able to communicate that in day-to-day healthcare is important.
We received a grant recently for $25,000 to launch a pilot program to bring the CommCard into the Tri-County area. So for us, it's Lynn, Benton, and Lincoln counties, into their middle schools and high schools, so that self-advocacy piece is starting early. John mentioned a conversation that he had with a pediatrician recently, and we were talking about how we're distributing this CommCard and the training associated with it among adults. And he encouraged us to go younger. They need to start learning how to self-advocate as soon as they realize that they need accommodations. That's about the time that they should be learning how to ask for them. So the pilot program will be bringing this card into middle and high schools. Of course, it's going to be mostly virtual now with the situation we're in, but we'll figure out ways to do that. And then at the same time, offering the training to the healthcare professionals that they would be using. So the healthcare professionals get the training, just like John was talking about, and how to accommodate people with developmental disabilities. The students or the young people are getting training on how to ask for accommodations and how to put this information on a card, how to use the card, when to present it. And then we'll be tracking the use of the card. And it really is going to give us a good picture of the use of the card, because really, fortunately, people will not need to use their CommCard with police that often, we hope. But people with developmental disabilities do use the healthcare system more than their typical counterparts. So to use it with their healthcare professional is probably more likely. So we'll be able to track the use of the card. How did it work? We'll be interviewing the healthcare professionals after they've seen the card and had a patient use the card and see how effective it was in changing the whole climate of the interaction, building trust, like John was talking about, patient and healthcare professional trust, which I think is absolutely imperative to people with developmental disabilities seeking the healthcare that they need. For any of us, it doesn't take much trauma to keep us from keeping that doctor's appointment. We look for opportunities to cancel that appointment sometimes. So we want to make sure that people with DD are comfortable visiting their healthcare professionals and getting the care that they need.
I'm curious with the CommCards, if for people who are listening and they want to take a look at them and consider having one of their own, is there a template available with instructions on how to do that? Is there someone that they can contact if they're interested in making their own CommCards, or if they're interested in talking with their loved ones about a CommCard?
Yeah, we do have information on our website, so you can start at www.arcbenton.org. And it will direct you to our sister site of arcacademy.org, where we are housing a lot of our training materials and informational materials and resources around the CommCard and other advocacy efforts that we have going on. So we're very careful about distributing the card. We don't want to just hand it out. We want to make sure that people have the training to go along with the card so that they know how to use it. And in fact, at our last CommCard training, which was, I think that was with the Philomath Police Department, we were having to kind of stop. We were doing some role play. So we would set up a scenario and say, okay, this is what happened. The police officer is going to ask you some questions as a witness, and let's just kind of see how it goes. Well, we just about invariably had to kind of cut the tape and say, okay, this will be a good time for you to say that you have a CommCard. Can I show it to you? So the card holder needs some training to get comfortable using the card, to understand when it's appropriate to use the card, when it's not appropriate to present that card. It's not a get out of jail free card, but it's also some information that you don't want to disclose in every situation. So the distribution of the cards comes at the training. So the process starts with a phone call to the ARC office, and then we will direct you. You can get information about the CommCards, but we'll direct you to the website, make sure you've got information. And then we will talk them through the process of completing the registration form. And then they actually get the card when they're at the training session. So we have their information in advance, we produce the card, and then when they show up and appear for a CommCard training session with a helping professional, they receive their card and they have opportunities to practice using it with the helping professionals that are present at the training session.
And they also have usually their advocate there so that the training and the role playing can continue at home.
Part of what our goal is with the CommCards is to have it be very individualized for each person who wants to get the card, because that way it's specific for that individual, and it's not, and even though the layout will be generally the same, the information on the card will be different for each individual. And we're wanting to have this be going through the ARC chapters and can be easily recovered. So that way, if somebody loses a card, then they can request a new one, or they can request to update their information and turn in their old card and for us to dispose of. And then that way, there's only that one card out there.
You don't have to worry about the version history.
We set up this scenario where a bicycle was stolen and the card holder fit the description of someone's call that said it was a person in a blue shirt with short brown hair. And so this person with a developmental disability who was on a bike happened to fit the description of the person that the witness saw. But we established beforehand that she did not steal this bike. This is your bike, but the police officer is going to be asking you some questions because he thinks that maybe you fit the description. Well, so that was the scenario we set. They started talking, and as soon as the police officer asked her, "Is this your bike?" she said, "No." And he said, "Well, whose bike is it?" "Well, I don't know." So we went totally off script, but it was such a good case in point for false confessions and how they come about through anxiety, through pressures, through social communication breakdown, and how those are very real things. So we thought, wow, this is perfect. This was not planned, but this is how it happens. And it's a good thing we did have some backup in that case, that she could call an advocate in and clarify some of the details before it got really messy.
And part of what the CommCard does is it brings the necessary accommodations to the officer or the first responders notification notice early, so that way they then don't have to spend a whole bunch of time and money later trying to figure out, okay, what accommodations does this person need, and what is it that, and what conditions do they have? Because you're identifying them right off the bat.
Cody, this might be a good time to show Chris what happens with working memory. Would you be willing to role play that with me or have that discussion with me?
So like I'm in, what is it, the 91st percentile, 93rd percentile for working memory.
Yep.
When I have no time constraints, but then when I do have a time constraint, it drops to what, the 35th percentile?
That's right. So we know that Cody doesn't work very well with a deadline. I mean, we can see that when he does a paper or whatever. And so this working memory test, it shows that his CPU unit, his brain, can do math problems really efficiently. He gets an A when he doesn't have a time constraint. If you throw a time constraint into the puzzle, then it's as though his CPU unit, his computer, his brain has too many files open. It slows everything down. He responds maybe more in that flight or fight or withdraw situation, or maybe he just can't answer. It takes him longer. That's what happened to the woman in that role playing when she was confronted by a police officer, and under that pressure, her working memory just declined to the point where she gave the wrong answers. And they were answers that would have gotten her in trouble in a normal situation with an uninformed officer. This is a demonstration of how providing early accommodations actually saves time and maybe money. So when I interact with Cody, I know that he needs extra time. And Cody, you have some accommodations through school, right?
Yes.
What are they?
So like I have extra time on assignments, quizzes, and exams. And so what I do is if I have to have a proctored exam, then I'll schedule it and they'll set it up so that I have 1.5 the time, 1.5 to double time that the other students in my course would have. But most of the time, what happens is that I don't need that full time. There's only been like one time where I've had to use that full double time slot. Otherwise, I've only had to use like half of it and only use the regular amount of time that everybody else would have. Because by having that extra time available to me, I then do not need that extra time. But if I did not have that extra time, I would go all the way up to the very end of the regular time and then still have questions to have to do. And so those questions would count against me on my final grade for that exam.
So just having the accommodation makes it so you don't necessarily need the accommodation. But if you didn't have the accommodation, it would make it so you would definitely need the accommodation plus some. But just having it de-escalates the situation for you, so you don't need it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Chris, you nailed it. So early provision of accommodations saves time, money, and misery. Early accommodation of accommodations means you need to provide fewer accommodations. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
If there were one thing that you wanted our listeners to know about this conversation around intellectual and developmental disabilities, what would that be?
I would say that we're talking about a much larger group than you realize, that there are so many more people out there that are not getting the accommodations that they need simply because either they don't know how to ask for them, they know they're not available, or because those professionals serving them are unable to identify that need early on.
I think that I want to agree with Diane and fill that out a little bit more. So in Benton County, we have 600 people that get services, DD services. We estimate that there are 15,000 people in Benton County with our population of 94,000 people, 15,000 that need accommodations. That's a lot of people. It's about 18%. And if you add other neurocognitive disabilities, for example, Alzheimer's, TBIs for our wounded warriors, then we're probably talking about 20,000 people. If we were to extrapolate to the state of Oregon, then we would fill a city the size of Portland with people who have developmental disabilities. So it's a substantial group of people.
I would say the takeaway that I want the audience to have is that just because somebody may appear normal and be able to act normally from in most situations does not mean that they could not have a intellectual or developmental disability. There's no way to know unless the person actually tells you that they have an intellectual or developmental disability. Unless they disclose that information, you're going to be assuming that they do not have a disability and don't need any accommodation whatsoever.
Well, with that thought, I think that is a great place to end our conversation today. I thank the three of you for joining me. I always enjoy our conversations. I always learn so much when I talk to you all. Thank you, Cody, Diane, and John, for your time today, and I look forward to our continued conversation.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Patrick Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocbhji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships at work within this complex and yet compelling field.